The air in the negotiation room smelled like burnt copper and sour sweat. Griffin didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man running on 3 hours of sleep and cheap stim-calf. Then, the 9-foot alien queen leaned over the table. "Human," she hissed. "My father often spoke of..." The station's life support system had a distinct arrhythmic rattle. Thump hiss. Thump hiss. It sounded like a dying lung. Griffin kept his eyes fixed on the scuffed aluminum table, timing his breaths to the mechanical wheeze. He dragged a thumb along the edge of his collar. The synthetic fabric of his diplomatic uniform was rigid, chafing the skin of his neck raw. He felt a bead of sweat detach from his hairline and trace a slow, agonizing path down his spine. He wasn't supposed to be here. Griffin was a logistics coordinator. His job involved spreadsheets, cargo manifests, and arguing with supply chain managers over the price of processed protein paste. He was a master of the mundane. But 3 days ago, the primary human envoy, Ambassador Hayes, had suffered a massive coronary event during transit. The backup, a fast-talking political appointee named Miller, had taken one look at the Kalen dreadnought hanging in the void outside the station's viewport and immediately boarded a shuttle back to the core worlds, citing a sudden and violent gastrointestinal illness. That left Griffin. He swallowed hard. The back of his throat tasted like old coffee and bile. Across the room, the heavy blast doors remained sealed. Behind them waited the Kalen delegation. For a century, humanity had lived in the shadow of the Kalen Empire. They weren't actively at war, but it was a cold, suffocating peace. The Kalen were older, larger, and possessed a casual, terrifying lethality. Humanity was a weed growing in the cracks of their pavement. Now, border skirmishes over a handful of mineral-rich dead rocks had pushed the two species to the brink of open conflict. The deck plates vibrated. Griffin's hand twitched on the table. He pulled it into his lap, curling his fingers into tight fists, digging his nails into his palms until the sharp pain grounded him. He focused on the sensation. Pain is real. Panic is a ghost. It was a mantra his father used to say. It didn't help much. The vibrations grew stronger. A low, rhythmic thumping echoed through the bulkheads. The Kalen didn't walk. They impacted. With a pressurized hiss, the heavy blast doors slid apart. The air pressure in the room shifted instantly, popping Griffin's ears. A smell washed over him, an overpowering scent of petrichor, crushed beetles, and a metallic tang that tasted like sucking on a bloody lip. 4 Kalen honor guards entered first. They were towering masses of deep purple chitin and biomechanical armor, standing 7 feet tall. Their limbs were multi-jointed, ending in thick, heavy claws that clicked against the metal floor plating. They carried no visible weapons because they didn't need them. A Kalen guard could tear a man in half with the casual effort a human might use to open a bag of chips. They fanned out, their multifaceted obsidian eyes scanning the small, poorly lit room. Then she entered. Queen Violis ducked slightly to clear the massive doorframe. Even hunched, she dominated the space. She was a full 2 feet taller than her guards. Her chitin was a mottled, iridescent black, catching the flickering fluorescent lights and reflecting them back as sickly green prisms. Heavy plates of ceremonial armor, forged from some dull grey metal that absorbed light, draped across her broad shoulders and thorax. Griffin didn't stand. He knew the protocol. The handbook stated that standing could be interpreted as a challenge to their physical dominance. He remained seated, forcing his breathing to stay slow, even as his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Vilis approached the table. She moved with a strange liquid grace that belied her immense bulk. She didn't sit in the reinforced chair provided for her. She simply stood looming over the opposite side of the table. Up close, Griffin could hear the wet, heavy sounds of her respiration. Sacs of tissue expanded and contracted behind the armor plating of her throat. She stared down at him. Griffin forced himself to look back. Not into her eyes. There were too many of them, and it made him dizzy. but at the bridge of her armoured snout, the silence stretched. It wasn't a profound, cinematic silence. It was an awkward, terrifying void. Griffin's leg began to bounce under the table. He clamped a hand over his knee to stop it. He felt entirely, absurdly small. He thought about his cramped apartment back on Earth, the leaky faucet he hadn't fixed, the half-eaten ration bar sitting on his desk. He was going to die here, millions of light years from home, because two governments couldn't agree on who owned a rock made of lithium. A low clicking sound emanated from the Queen's mandibles. It was a wet, scraping noise like two stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. "You're not the designated speaker," she said. Her voice wasn't spoken. It was projected through a translation collar at her throat. But the synthesized English carried the harsh, guttural undertones of her native tongue. Griffin's mouth was dry. He unglued his tongue from the roof of his mouth. "Ambassador Hayes is dead," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. He hated himself for it. "I am Griffin. I am acting as the representative for the United Earth Coalition." Queen Vilis tilted her massive head. The joints in her neck popped loudly. She didn't blink. "A logistics drone," she stated. It wasn't an insult. It was a simple categorization. "Yes." She leaned forward. The table groaned under the sudden weight as she braced two of her primary limbs against the metal surface. The smell of copper and ozone intensified, making Griffin's eyes water. "Human," she hissed, the translator struggling to smooth out the sharp edges of her tone. "My father often spoke of your kind." Griffin froze. His mind raced, shuffling through decades of historical briefs he had skimmed on the transport ship. Her father was Emperor Kael Thos, a warlord who had subjugated half the Orion Spur before dying in a succession dispute 20 years ago. During Kael Thos's reign, humanity had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. They had been a blip on the Emperor's radar, a localized infestation on the galactic fringe. "He did," Griffin managed, the words slipping out before his filter could catch them. He sounded pathetic. He sounded exactly like a man who spent his days counting shipping crates. Queen Vilis did not move. Her face, an impenetrable mask of hardened shell and sensory pits, gave nothing away. "Yes, he encountered your species during the siege of the Cinder Belt." Griffin remembered the Cinder Belt. It wasn't a proud military victory. It was a slaughter. A human mining colony had refused to cede a resource-heavy asteroid field to a passing Kaelan fleet. The humans hadn't stood a chance. They were miners, not soldiers. They had jury-rigged laser cutters and strapped explosive charges to mining drones. The Kaelan had vaporized their primary habitat in the first hour. Yet, the siege had dragged on for 3 excruciating months. "He found your species illogical," the Queen continued. The translator buzzed with static. "He recorded his observations. He noted that your physiology is fragile. Your skin tears on jagged rock. Your bones splinter under minimal kinetic pressure. Your internal organs fail when exposed to standard radiation levels." She leaned closer. The heat radiating off her massive body was palpable. Griffin could feel it baking the skin of his face. "When an organism is outmatched," Vilis said, her voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated against Griffin's sternum, "biological imperative dictates surrender or flight. It is the calculus of survival. My father noted that when a Kaelan warrior is dismembered, they accept their death and cease energy expenditure. It is efficient." She pulled back slightly, her mandibles twitching. But at the Cinder Belt, he watched a human, missing its lower extremities, drag its torso across the regolith to manually detonate a fuel cell. It achieved nothing. The fleet was unharmed. The human was incinerated. It was a statistically meaningless gesture. Griffin swallowed the lump in his throat. His collar felt tighter. The air in the room was stifling, heavy with the alien's exhalations. "My father called it a glitch in your genetic code," she said. "A failure of evolutionary logic. He spoke of it often before he died. He wondered how a species so crippled by its own fragility had managed to leave its host star." The Queen finally sat. The reinforced chair creaked ominously beneath her, the metal protesting the unnatural weight. She rested her upper arms on the table, the sharp, serrated edges of her forearms digging into the aluminum. We are at a precipice, Griffin, of logistics, she said. My generals demand we cleanse the border. They look at your fleets and see fragile glass waiting to be shattered. They look at your biology and see meat. They do not understand why I agree to this parley. Griffin's chest was tight. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his ribs. He was supposed to negotiate mining rights. He was supposed to offer trade concessions. He wasn't equipped to explain the existential philosophy of human stubbornness to a 9-foot apex predator. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Not a dramatic, cinematic tremble, but a pathetic, high-frequency vibration. He was terrified. He was so terrified he wanted to vomit. What would a hero say, he thought wildly. A hero would look her in the eye and give a speech about human indomitability, about the human spirit, about how we never surrender. But Griffin wasn't a hero. He was a tired, cynical man who knew exactly how broken humanity was. He knew about the corruption in the coalition. He knew about the supply shortages, the terrified conscripts, the politicians who sold out entire colonies to save their own careers. He knew that humanity wasn't some united, shining beacon of courage. They were a mess. He looked back up at the Queen. Your father was right, Griffin said. The words tasted like ash. Behind the Queen, one of the honour guards shifted, its armour clanking loudly in the quiet room. Vilis raised a single clawed finger, and the guard froze instantly. Explain, the Queen demanded. Griffin let out a long, shaky breath. He was right. We are fragile. We break easily. And that gesture you talked about? The miner dragging himself across the dirt to blow up a fuel cell? Griffin gave a short, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humour. It was an ugly sound. That wasn't bravery, Your Majesty. Queen Vilis tilted her head in the opposite direction. Her multifaceted eyes seemed to dial in, focusing entirely on Griffin's pale, sweaty face. If it was not bravery, what was it? Griffin slumped back in his chair. The rigid posture of a diplomat abandoned him, replaced by the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had been running on fumes for 3 days. He scrubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. It was spite, Griffin said, his voice flat. It was raw, unfiltered spite. He looked at the alien monarch. He didn't care about the protocol anymore. He was too tired to be terrified. You, Kalen, you operate on logic. You fight for territory, for honour, for efficiency. If you're beaten, you accept it because the math says you've lost. Griffin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He ignored the smell of ozone. Humans don't do math when we're dying. We do fear. He pointed a shaking finger at his own chest. We are terrified all the time. We're born naked, blind, and soft in a universe that wants to kill us. We spent our entire history running from predators with bigger teeth and sharper claws. Fear is our baseline. It's hardwired into our brains. Griffin dropped his hand, staring at the scuffed metal between them. When that miner was dragging himself across the ground, he wasn't thinking about Earth. He wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking, I am in agony. I am terrified. I am going to die, and I want to make it your problem. The room went dead silent. Even the arrhythmic wheeze of the life support seemed to pause. Griffin looked up, meeting the Queen's gaze. Your father thought it was a genetic glitch. It's not. It's our entire operating system. We're so afraid of dying that when we realize we can't avoid it, the fear rots into hatred. We don't fight to the last man because we're brave. We fight to the last man because we want you to bleed for making us afraid. He leaned back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his sternum. He had just told the most powerful being in the sector that humanity was driven by cowardly, irrational malice. He waited for the massive claw to reach across the table and sever his head from his shoulders. Instead, Queen Vilis remained perfectly still. Her breathing slowed. The expanding tissue at her throat ceased its violent pumping. "Fear," she repeated. The translator rendered the word flat, but there was a strange cadence to her natural clicking beneath the synthesis. "My kind does not experience fear. We experience caution. We calculate risk." "I know," Griffin said quietly. "That's why your generals want a war. They calculated the risk. They looked at our ships, our thin skin, our brittle bones, and they ran the numbers. They think it'll be a clean sweep." Griffin surprised himself by reaching into his uniform pocket. The guards twitched, raising their arms, but Vilis hissed a sharp, sudden command in her native tongue. The guards froze. Griffin pulled out a crumpled, stained ration wrapper and a plastic stylus. He tossed them onto the table. They looked pathetic sitting there. "Oh, they ran the numbers on a war," Griffin said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But you can't run numbers on an infection, and that's what fighting us is. If your fleets cross the border, you will win the space battles. You will bomb our cities. You will burn our colonies." He leaned in, his eyes locked on hers. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a man who moved cargo, and he knew exactly how much cargo it took to bury a civilization. "But you will have to send ground troops eventually," Griffin continued, the words spilling out of him, fueled by exhaustion and a dark, cynical truth. "And when you do, you'll find humans waiting in the rubble. We won't fight you in lines. We'll poison your water supplies. We'll strap explosives to our children. We will hide in the mud and wait 3 days just to jam a rusted piece of metal into the joints of your armor." Griffin felt a tear slip down his cheek, hot and shameful. He didn't wipe it away. "We will make it so ugly, so thoroughly, disgustingly horrific, that your logical minds will break trying to comprehend it. We will die. We will absolutely die. But we will make sure you choke on the ashes." The silence returned, heavier this time. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on Griffin's shoulders. He had laid it all out. The ugly, unvarnished truth of his species. There was no nobility in it. Just a desperate, cornered animal snarling at the dark. Queen Vilis looked at the crumpled plastic wrapper on the table, then back up to Griffin's red, tear-streaked face. She slowly retracted her arms from the table and sat back. "My generals," the Queen said, the translator echoing in the sterile room, "believe that victory is defined by the extermination of the enemy's military assets." "And what do you believe?" Griffin asked, his voice barely a rasp. Vilis clicked her mandibles. It was a slow, deliberate sound. "I believe my father was a fool," she said. "He confused a fragile shell with a fragile will." She stood up. The sudden movement made Griffin flinch, pressing himself back into his chair. But she didn't reach for him. She towered over the table, her iridescent armor casting strange shadows against the bulkhead. "You are a creature of profound contradictions, Griffin of logistics," she said. "You shake with terror, you weep openly, yet you promise me a nightmare with absolute conviction." "It's not a promise," Griffin said, staring up at her. "It's just logistics, cause and effect." "Then let us discuss logistics," the Queen commanded. She gestured to the empty chair. "Sit up, fix your collar. You're an unseemly sight. We have a border to redraw." Griffin didn't sit up straight. His spine felt like a stack of cracked porcelain, fragile and grinding against itself. He did, however, tug at his collar, popping the magnetic clasp that had been slowly strangling him. The harsh, synthetic fabric gave way, allowing a rush of aggressively recycled station air to cool the sweat pooled at his throat. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath. It tasted like tin and old adrenaline. "Logistics," Griffin muttered, the word feeling foreign on his tongue after the sheer existential terror of the last 10 minutes. He reached out with a trembling hand and tapped the console embedded in the center of the scuffed aluminum table. The console whined, a high-pitched, failing capacitor sound, before throwing up a flickering 3-dimensional holographic projection. The room was instantly bathed in a cold, sterile blue light. It illuminated the underside of Queen Vilis's jaw, casting the jagged, interlocking plates of her mandibles into sharp relief. In the blue tint, she looked less like a biological organism and more like a derelict warship floating in the void. The hologram displayed the disputed border, 7 star systems. 3 of them possessed habitable low-gravity moons. 4 were dead rock, choked with radiation and violent tectonic activity. And all of them were saturated with grade A industrial lithium and heavy radioactives. Velis leaned over the projection. Her massive multi-jointed fingers, each ending in a claw the size of a combat knife, hovered over the glowing blue spheres. She didn't touch the light. "My generals look at this projection," the Queen said, her synthesized voice slicing through the hum of the hollow emitter. "They see a straight line, a vector, a simple equation of mass and kinetic energy. We deploy the 3rd and 7th fleets. We shatter your orbital defenses at Aegis Prime. We establish a beachhead. The mathematical probability of total sector control within 4 standard cycles is 99.7%. Griffin stared at the floating blue orbs. He didn't see straight lines. He saw shipping manifests. He saw fuel consumption rates, ration distributions, and the horrifying bureaucratic nightmare of keeping people alive in places where the universe actively wanted them dead. "Your generals are idiots," Griffin said. The honor guards at the perimeter of the room tensed, a synchronized symphony of grinding chitin and shifting armor plates. Vilis merely flared the respiratory vents along her thorax. A sudden gust of petrichor and ozone washed over Griffin, strong enough to make him cough. "A bold statement," she rumbled, "for a creature made of soft meat sitting in a metal box." "It's not bold, it's math," Griffin countered, his voice steadying. The sheer, overwhelming familiarity of his job was acting as a bizarre anchor against the panic. He leaned over the table, plunging his hands into the holographic projection. He expanded the view of Aegis Prime, a dusty, miserable mining colony that currently served as humanity's primary staging ground. "Look at this," Griffin demanded, pointing a finger at the topographic lines. "Aegis Prime. It's a rock. The atmosphere is toxic. The water table is 90% sulfuric acid. The only way we survive down there is through heavy industrial scrubbers and a subterranean network that goes 6 miles deep into the crust." He swiped his hand, bringing up a complex tangled web of red lines that connected Aegis Prime to the inner human colonies. "This is our supply chain," Griffin continued, the words coming faster now. "It takes a human freighter 2 weeks to haul water purifiers and synthetic proteins to Aegis. We lose 1 in 10 ships to micrometeoroid impacts or failing FTL drives. It is a logistical nightmare just to keep 1 million humans breathing on that rock." Queen Vilis watched him, her primary eyes unblinking, black voids absorbing the blue light. "Irrelevant. My fleets do not require water purifiers. We do not require synthetic protein. We are self-sustaining for stellar cycles. In space? Sure," Griffin fired back. "But you want to control the lithium mines. The lithium is underground. You can't mine it from orbit. You can't bomb it. Or you destabilize the tectonic plates and sink the entire deposit into the mantle. You have to go down there. You have to send your soldiers into the tunnels." Griffin tapped the surface of Aegis Prime in the hologram. The blue light rippled. "Your warriors are 9 feet tall," Griffin said, looking up at her immense bulk. "They weigh what? A ton and a half in full armor." 1.2 metric tons, Vilis corrected, her tone flat. "Right. 1.2 metric tons, Griffin repeated, dragging a hand through his damp, thinning hair. "Do you know what happens when a 1.2-ton biological tank walks into a human mining tunnel built for guys who are 5'9" and live on powdered soup? You don't fit." The Queen's mandibles twitched. It was a minuscule movement, but in the harsh light of the hologram, Griffin caught it. "You don't fit," Griffin pressed, leaning closer to the projection. "Your troops won't be able to stand up. They won't be able to turn around. They will be crawling through the dark, breathing our toxic dust, while our miners, who know every blind corner, every pressure valve, every structural weak point, hunt them." Griffin deleted the supply line projection and replaced it with a simple, rotating 3D model of a standard Kalan dropship. "And when your troops are down there bleeding out in the dark, they are going to need extraction," Griffin said, his voice dropping into a cynical, gravelly cadence. "They will need medical supplies. They will need specialized mechanics to fix the armor joints that get clogged with Aegis's corrosive sand, which means your fleets, sitting comfortably in orbit, now have to establish a planetary supply line. He stared directly into the Queen's multifaceted eyes. Have your generals ever run a planetary occupation supply line on a hostile toxic world where the local populace is actively trying to poison the very air you breathe? Silence hung in the room. The rhythmic thump hiss of the life support system seemed incredibly loud. No, Vilas said softly. The translator collar whirred, struggling with the low register of her voice. Our conquests are historically absolute. We do not occupy, we eradicate, and then we harvest. You can't eradicate us without destroying the prize, Griffin said. He slumped back into his chair, the brief surge of adrenaline leaving him hollowed out and violently exhausted. If you bomb the surface, the mines collapse. If you send in troops, we trap them in the dark and bleed them out. You will spend more credits, more fuel, and more lives trying to extract a single ton of lithium than the lithium is actually worth. He gestured vaguely at the holographic map. Your generals are looking at a war, but war is just violent logistics, and the logistics of fighting humans on our own turf is a zero-sum game. You will win the war, Your Majesty, but you will bankrupt your empire holding the territory. Queen Vilas stood motionless. The blue light from the table cast deep shadows beneath her armor plates, making her look ancient, a relic of a more brutal, straightforward time. She reached out, her massive claw passing through the hologram of the dropship, dissolving the light into a static haze before it reformed. A parasite, the Queen murmured. Griffin offered a weak, lopsided smile. It lacked any trace of humour. A highly motivated, spiteful parasite. Yes. My generals demand blood, Vilas said, her gaze drifting from the projection to Griffin. They are young. They did not fight in the Cinder Belt. They only know the simulations. They see a galaxy that should yield to our mass. If I return to the capital and order a retreat based on the logistical warnings of Human Clark, they will view it as weakness. A challenge to the throne will follow. Griffin rubbed his eyes. They burned. He felt a profound, crushing headache building behind his temples. This was the crux of it. It wasn't about the rocks. It was never about the rocks. It was about politics. An alien monarchy millions of light years away, and it all boiled down to the same petty, ego-driven posturing that caused riots back in the slums of old Chicago. So, you need a victory, Griffin said tiredly. You need to take something back to your generals to shut them up. You need a pound of flesh. A human idiom, Vilas noted, her head tilting, but accurate. I require a concession that demonstrates Kaelin's supremacy. If I do not get it, I will be forced to authorize the invasion to maintain order within my own ranks. The zero-sum game will commence. We will both lose, but my empire will survive the loss. Yours will not. Griffin stared at the holographic map. He looked at the 7 disputed systems. He looked at Aegis Prime. He thought about the millions of people living in the subterranean slums, coughing up black dust, working 12-hour shifts just to afford a synthetic ration bar. He thought about his own cramped apartment, the leaky faucet. He was a logistics coordinator. His entire life was about finding the most efficient way to move a box from point A to point B without breaking the contents. Right now, humanity was the box, and the box was incredibly fragile. What if, Griffin started, his voice barely a whisper. He cleared his throat, trying to dislodge the dryness. What if you don't take the territory? What if we give it to you? The Queen's mandibles clicked sharply, a sound of distinct alien confusion. Explain. Griffin sat forward, ignoring the protest of his spine. His hands flew across the console, pulling up legal parameters, trade agreements, and resource manifests that he had memorized on the miserable, cramped flight to this station. You want the lithium, Griffin said, his fingers dancing across the glowing interface. Your generals want the glory of expanding the Kaelin Empire's borders. Fine. We formally cede the 7 disputed systems to the Kaelin throne. You plant your flags, you update your star maps, Aegis Prime and the dead rocks belong to you. The Queen leaned in. the scent of crushed beetles intensifying. A total surrender of the territory. My generals would accept this. But what is the trap, human? You have just spent a standard hour convincing me of your species' inherent malice. You do not surrender. We don't, Griffin agreed, his eyes fixed on the data stream scrolling across the hologram. We cede the territory. It is legally Kaelan space. But the infrastructure currently on Aegis Prime, the deep core drills, the subterranean scrubbers, the refinement plants, that's proprietary human technology, owned by the United Earth Coalition. Griffin looked up, meeting her gaze. He felt a cold, calculated calm settling over him. It was the calm of a man balancing a ledger. We leave the people, Griffin said, the words tasting like copper. The human miners stay. They become contractors. Your empire owns the land, but you hire the coalition to extract the ore. You don't have to send a single soldier into the tunnels. You don't have to build a planetary supply line. You park a dreadnought in orbit, and we load the refined lithium directly into your cargo bays. Queen Violet remained utterly still. The silence stretched, tight, and dangerous. You would sell your own kind into servitude, the Queen stated. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of a newly discovered grotesque reality. Griffin flinched. The word servitude stung, a sharp physical prick behind his ribs. He thought of the miners. They would be working on a Kaelan-owned rock. They would be under the shadow of alien guns. It was a betrayal. It was dirty, but it wasn't dead. It's a trade agreement, Griffin said, his voice hard, lacking any of its previous tremor. They get paid. We set a fixed market rate for the extraction. Your empire gets the raw materials at a fraction of the cost it would take to mine it yourselves. You get your victory. You tell your generals that humanity was so terrified of your might that we handed over the keys and agreed to do the digging for you. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat. It strokes their egos. It secures your throne, and it keeps your 1.2-ton nightmares out of our tunnels. The Queen slowly dragged a massive claw along the edge of the aluminum table, carving a deep, curling trench into the metal. The screeching sound set Griffin's teeth on edge. And the dependency? Violet asked, her translator catching the sudden sharp drop in her tone. You construct a scenario where my empire relies on human labor. If you cease extraction, our supply chain is severed. Yes, Griffin said frankly. That's the insurance policy. You own the rock, but we hold the shovel. If you try to glass the planet later, or if you decide to alter the deal, the lithium stops flowing. It binds us together. Mutually assured logistics. Queen Violet stared at him. The multifaceted black orbs of her eyes seemed to bore through his skull, dissecting the soft, terrified, spiteful meat inside. Griffin didn't look away. He couldn't. If he blinked, if he broke eye contact, he felt like the illusion of control would shatter, and she would simply reach out and crush his skull. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was the heavy, wet respiration of the alien monarch and the dying rattle of the station's air recyclers. Then, the Queen stepped back. She stood to her full, towering height, her armor plates clashing together with the sound of a closing vault door. She looked down at the scratched table, at the flickering blue hologram, and finally at Griffin. My father, she rumbled, the sound vibrating through the floorboards, believed that the true measure of a species was how they faced their own destruction. She reached out with one massive hand. Griffin's breath hitched, his muscles locking in primal terror. But she didn't strike him. She picked up the crumpled, stained ration wrapper he had tossed on the table earlier. She held it delicately between two razor-sharp claws, inspecting the cheap plastic. He was wrong, Violet said. Your species does not face destruction. You bargain with it. You sell it your pride, your territory, and your own people, just to ensure you wake up the next cycle. She dropped the wrapper. It fluttered to the metal deck. It is entirely devoid of honor, the Queen decreed. Griffin let out a slow, rattling breath. We can't afford honor, Your Majesty. It's not in the budget. Violet clicked her mandibles, a rapid staccato burst. I accept your terms, Griffin of Logistics. Draw up the treaties. Use your ledgers. My scribes will review them before the cycle ends. The disputed systems belong to the Kalan Empire. The human vermin may continue to dig in the dirt. She turned, her massive bulk pivoting with that same fluid, unnatural grace. The honor guards instantly fell into formation around her, a wall of impenetrable purple chitin. A word of caution, human, Vilis said, pausing at the threshold of the blast doors. She didn't look back. Do not confuse this compromise with peace. It is merely a transaction. The day your spite outweighs your utility, the math will change, and my generals will have their blood. I'll keep that in mind, Griffin whispered to her back. The heavy blast doors hissed shut, sliding together with a solid, definitive thud. The pressure in the room equalized. The smell of petrichor and ozone immediately began to dissipate, sucked away by the struggling ventilation system. Griffin sat alone in the blue light of the hologram. He didn't cheer. He didn't feel a triumphant surge of victory. He felt like a hollowed-out shell. He looked at the projection of Aegis Prime, thinking of the miners who were about to wake up to the news that their world had been sold to monsters to buy humanity a few more years of breathing room. They would hate him. The politicians back on Earth would parade him as a hero, claiming a diplomatic masterpiece. But the people in the dirt would know the truth. He had saved them by chaining them to the dark. Griffin reached down to his lap. His hands were still shaking. The tremors were worse now that the immediate danger had passed. He felt a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead, and his stomach gave a violent, sickening lurch. He leaned over, resting his head against the cool metal of the table edge, closing his eyes against the glaring blue light of the star map. He was alive. Humanity was intact. The ledgers were balanced. Slowly, painfully, Griffin pushed himself upright. He reached across the table and tapped the console, shutting off the projection. The room plunged into the dim, flickering reality of standard station lighting. He pulled his datapad from his jacket pocket, the screen glowing brightly in the gloom. He had treaties to draft. He had shipping manifests to reroute. He had to figure out how many metric tons of synthetic protein it would take to keep 1 million indentured miners from starving over the next fiscal quarter. Griffin rubbed his raw, chafed neck, sighed into the empty room and began to type. If you want more grounded, gritty sci-fi stories where humanity survives not through shining heroism, but through stubborn, spiteful logistics, smash that like button, share this video with your crew, and subscribe. Leave a comment below. Did Griffin make the right call, or did he just delay the inevitable? See you in the next one.